have you come across John Bird in your travels?
Yes.
He's bristling with facts, and he can speak at length of the facts that he stores in his mental capacity, which seems to be bottomless. He also is good value because he speaks without boring you. And he has this understanding of the time in which we're living, which is quite particular. He analyzes what has happened since 1830 and comes out with this conclusion that we are living in the Marian age, because things started to move in Rue de Bac in 1830. You know the story, don't you? This little angel waking up this poor little postulant, Catherine, and off she went through the cloister to the chapel where everything was lit as though for midnight mass, and this beautiful lady came and sat on the priest's chair, and she was invited to come up right next to her and even put her hands on her lap. That is quite startling as regards the intimacy of heaven and how close sometimes we can get to divine and human majesty, Queen of heaven and earth, allowing this little lassie who represents us to come right next to her. But then it went on. Now, do you know that when she came back in 1857, I believe, in Lourdes, this little lassie was by then a grown-up nun, and she heard about it, and she is known to have exclaimed, "C'est la même!" It's the same one. She knew that there was continuity. But by then something had happened. Pius IX in 1854 had had the courage of his convictions and proclaimed, using his papal authority, this dogma, instinctively believed, but never as such put in writing in that form. And then, of course, we have this little, again, lassie, even more illiterate, coming out with, trying to repeat the word that she'd heard to the parish priest. She said that she was l'Immaculée Conception. And he copped on. So he took her seriously. And it didn't stop there. We have other apparitions in the French and Belgian area. La Salette is an interesting one, more relevant than we think. She appeared as a poor peasant woman, weeping, her hands covering her face, and she explained why she was weeping. Her son had reserved 1 day out of 7 for himself, but men would not give it to him. And those who are working, those who are driving the carts, cannot work without taking his name in vain. 2 very Irish sins. Now, the 1800s in France were very vexed. The church came back with a vengeance. Eventually, it was another country who was going to get into trouble. And when she came back in 1917, already with a forerunner, the Angel of Peace, coming in 1916, she was coming at a time when the whole world by then was at war, but in 1917, when something also was going to happen which would affect politically the whole planet, communism. So there's a certain urgency about what she comes out with at Fatima. Now, I believe that experts will tell you that there's a hint at the end of the series of events at Fatima that she had already in the back of her mind the intention to give a hint that she would come back. And a place was sort of indicated, but not clearly enough. But the experts say that the hint was there and that it was corresponding to the series of Garabandal. There, it was quashed immediately by the local bishop, and because he has authority, that remained, and also his successor. However, we know now that there was a great influence in that decision coming from a psychologist who had worked on the case and had come out with a negative conclusion. In the 80s, he made a U-turn and went public about it. You can actually see it on YouTube. He explains why it was insufficient and incorrect, and his opinion had been tendentious and it was not valid. He'd obviously studied more, and the difference with that particular series is the first one that we actually have close enough to us to have modern gadgets to captivate it as it's happening. All these strange events which are not fabricable, running backwards and so on without falling over. And so we have now the present bishop and his predecessor completely in favour of Garabandal in the area. So that counts. And so it's being looked at again. We also have still alive the main visionary, now married in the States, a very balanced person. Mary Lodi has since died. Now, in suspense is the sequence of Medjugorje, and it cannot but be such because it's ongoing. But say what you like, those who go there are touched. So, it's not in the interest of old Nick to touch souls. If it's not broken, don't mend it. Heaven is certainly very close to earth there. Certainly the sacraments are well celebrated, and grace is passing. But we forget that other continents too have ongoing events or recent events, Venezuela and so on. And I, for a few moments this evening, want to bring you to another one which, although immediately concluded, is not concluded in its results. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. We're in Japan. Sister Agnes, on the 6th of June 1973, had this experience. She was given a message of prayer and sacrifice for the glory of the Father and salvation of souls. On August the 3rd, it was for prayer, penance, and courageous sacrifices to soften the Father's anger. Now that is very close to the messages of Fatima. We know that Our Lady indicated that souls were being lost, and that was in the context of the First World War, when many were going into the beyond in the trenches without anyone to pray for them and make sacrifices for them, and she showed them where they were in danger of going. Now, this next bit is the crunch. Notice the date, the 13th of October, 1973. The actual anniversary of the final visions and miracle of Fatima. We have this message coming through. Now, remember that this series was closely studied by a commission on the ground, and because of the very strong evidence of its miraculous nature, because there were all kinds of things going on, the bishop and the commission accepted it, and under the guidance of the Vatican, the CDF, under Ratzinger at the time, it was accepted and proclaimed authentic. So we're here in a church-approved series of events. And these are the words given, it would seem, at that occasion. As I told you, if men do not repent and better themselves, the Father will inflict a terrible punishment on all humanity. It will be a punishment greater than the deluge, such as one will never have seen before. Now it goes into some detail about this fire, and it talks about a large part of humanity being lost. The only alms which will remain for you will be the rosary. It takes us straight back to Fatima. The only thing insisted upon each time, in each of the apparitions. And the sign left by my son. Each day recite the prayers of the rosary. With the rosary, pray for the Pope, the bishops, and the priests. We have, in the series of events of Akita, an indication that one of the problems which is distressing heaven much is what is going to happen. An increasing disunity amongst even bishops and actually cardinals. In other words, civil strife within the church, division, and not helped by those who precisely are there to keep the church together, priests and bishops. We have this all going on in the context of two things. The Blessed Sacrament, because these are handmaids of the Blessed Sacrament, and things are continually happening in a miraculous way around the tabernacle. And this statue, which is weeping, first of all, tears, and then, I believe, blood. And there is a constant indication that the crunch is the Blessed Sacrament being abused. On June the 12th, when she opened the tabernacle for adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, a very strong light came from it and filled the entire chapel. This happened for 3 days. When Sister Agnes asked the other sisters if they had seen anything out of the ordinary, they said no. This strong light also came from the tabernacle on the feast of Corpus Christi. When she told the bishop, that's Bishop Ito, the one eventually who got into this, he advised her to keep it in her heart. On the vigil of the Feast of the Sacred Heart that same year, her guardian angel, that takes us straight back to the back, appeared to her and asked her to pray the Fatima Decade prayer after each decade of the Rosary. At that date, this prayer was not well known in Japan, and she had trouble in understanding it. But the sisters began to recite the prayer, and it has now spread throughout Japan. You know the one? Oh my Jesus, forgive us our sins. And that, by the way, reminds us of the third secret part of it, the fires of hell, which they were shown on behalf of us. One might say, why show children and frighten them? Well, she's a good mother, and we're all big children. And by showing these pure souls the reality of what's in danger of waiting us, she's trying to warn us before we get there. Not believing in something because we've grown up doesn't change one iota with regard to the degree of its existence, because what is in the mind is in the mind. What is out there is out there. Fact is not influenced by thought. Either it is or it isn't. And I understand that the majority of people who find themselves there, lost on the other side, when they were here, did not believe in it. So it's a great game on the part of the tempter of the soul, of whom we think on this day, the one that was crushed by the Immaculate, to coax them into either not thinking about it or cancelling it from the agenda by placing it in the same category as Santa Claus. In 1980, the newly elected John Paul II found himself in Germany. The German bishops at Fulda tried to pump him, see if we can get this pontiff to open his mouth. And he was pressed. They wanted to know what exactly was said at Fatima. Now, we're not quite sure, but it would seem from careful study that it was reported independently and accurately by two separate people, both reliable, and that it was exactly corresponding, word for word, what he said in reply. He did not believe it prudent to open that secret, make it known, because if it were, it would encourage Russia to do something. Now, he did, however, according to this report, go into a certain amount of detail. What is interesting is that a little later, around about 1988, Cardinal Ratzinger also was squeezed. And it was answering this that made it interesting, because he did say something to this effect, that there is nothing in the third secret which does not correspond to already authenticated Marian apparitions. And he's the one who was approving, through Bishop Ito, this series, and had just done so. It is interesting. The present Pope has spoken on 4 occasions in public about a possible Third World War. Now, for him to say that in public is noteworthy. What is certain is that if one looks around and opens one's eyes and ears, one can suss out a huge danger of political imbalance on a massive scale and in a short time. What is also sure is that if one looks at the invisible warfare going on, the balance between evil, sin, and reparation is no longer keeping the equilibrium that through victim souls hitherto it has. So what happens? It's cyclic, it happens. One thing eventually leads to another until balance is re-established, usually through suffering. And that means big suffering when it's got big. So that's the backdrop to the interventions of Our Blessed Lady right now. She's a good mother. She's trying her best to get through to us from where she sits on her crown of glory, and she's warning us we've only got a certain amount of time, whether it's individuals or whether as a planet. And if we don't get our act together, eventually, probably, something will go wrong. Oh, yes.